decide what the rules of the game are. They will decide what regulates their own authority and the authority of the other branches of government. So we are not a democracy. We are technically a juristocracy. This, I see your face, and I understand this looks completely surreal, but this is the world of our judicial system. It's when you explain it to others, they think you must have not understood what's going on because it is so crazy. For many years now, the power of the judiciary has been rising at the expense of the elected branches of government. And this began because in 1977, the labor movement lost power to Menachem Begin and Likud. And they were completely shocked because they thought that this was the beginning of fascism. And so they began transferring the centers of decision-making from the elected branches of government, where the right was gaining power, to the judiciary, which was still controlled by the old elites, and which, unlike other countries, has a veto power over the appointment of its own associate judges. So this became a preserve for people who can't win electoral politics.
Do they have a literal veto power, or are you saying that because of the number of...
No. They have the way the committee is constructed has 3 judges in it, 3 judges from the Supreme Court, and you need a majority of 7 out of 9. So if you have 3 judges, you have veto power over the appointments of any new associate. It was changed. It went through several reforms before they had more control. Now they only have a veto. Before they could just make the appointments more or less. And
one of the things that was supposed to be reformed is the reform.
Yeah, that was the key element. When the reform was introduced, I had Yariv Levin, the Minister of Justice, who authored the reform, in my podcast, explain it for a good hour. It's also available with English translation. It's not nostalgia. It's not anymore. It's not a reform anymore. But as we chatted, he said after the thing, he said the most important thing is the appointment of judges, because they keep duplicating the same DNA of these leftist, progressive stances. So they gradually acquired a power of judicial review. They acquired control of appointments in the civil service. They took for themselves, in many ways, a sly avenues to control ministerial policy, until this too was institutionalized, where the legal advisor to the minister has veto power over the minister's policy, which is completely ridiculous in a democratic country. A minister is like a cabinet member. So it would be like a secretary in the United States, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so on. And not only can they veto policy on grounds of legality, they can also veto policy on grounds of reasonableness. Now, since these legal advisors they're supposedly part of the executive branch, but they really answer to the court, they can block any policy that the court doesn't want, but by saying, I cannot defend this in court. So if you go ahead and do it despite my good advice, then this would be appealed to the court, and I will not be able to defend it. So ministers defer to them because they don't want their policies struck down by court. So basically the court has also asserted its completely invented authority to strike down constitutional amendments. So imagine what this is. The court is now our unelected permanent constitutional convention.
So-
They will decide what the rules of the game are. They will decide what regulates their own authority and the authority of the other branches of government. So we are not a democracy. We are technically a juristocracy.
When you say the amendment to the Constitution, that's basic laws. Right?
Yeah, I should have been more precise. There is no constitution, but the basic laws have been declared by the court to have constitutional status because they can use them as standards by which to strike down legislation. So Parliament moved to change the basic laws, and now they said, we can also veto changes on the basic law based on a theory that there are some mystical principles of the system that only judges know. They claim that the whole of the constitutional structure of Israel is based on the idea of it being a Jewish democratic state. And if they judge something to be in violation of those supra-constitutional principles, then you can't change the Constitution. The thing is that these supra-constitutional principles are beyond the reach of Parliament. They're not written anywhere. So elected representatives can't change them. And so the judges are more like the religious council of Iran. They have access to these ethereal principles, and they will tell us what they mean, and they will tell us what violates them. And so they will tell us what rules we're allowed to make and what rules we're not allowed to make. This, I see your face, and I understand this looks completely surreal, but this is the world of our judicial system. It's when you explain it to others, they think you must have not understood what's going on because it is so crazy. But it is. They have a standard called the reasonable person. And there was the constitutional amendment that they struck down was the one about reasonableness. Because they took the idea of extreme unreasonableness, which you find in other countries, so that courts can strike down something that is completely absurd on the basis of it being absurd and not a violation of law. I'll give you an example that I heard from jurists here. There is a person in Tel Aviv municipality who has the authority to decide which sidewalks would be painted red and white where you can't park and which will be blue and white where you can park. That official theoretically has the authority to decide that you will not park anywhere in Tel Aviv. If he paints all the sidewalks with red and white, that is patently absurd, and a court in most systems can strike it down for being absurd. The rule is that no reasonable person would think that this is reasonable. Now they stretch the idea of reasonableness to say that what is reasonable in the eyes of the judge. And so they struck down laws with a majority decision in court, which means it's not all reasonable persons would see this as absurd enough to be struck down, because unless you say that some of the judges are completely unreasonable. So they've stretched it in such a way that the court can now strike down and interfere with policy and legislation based on the judgment of the judge that in his view, it's not reasonable, i.e. it's not a good idea. So this gave them an instrument beyond the law. The judges, I'm a student of American culture, and Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that it gives him special pleasure to approve the constitutionality of laws that he thinks are as stupid as possible, because he said, it then allows me to tell the difference between what I would forbid and the Constitution permits. You, the judge, are not there to impose your ideas of what the good policy is. You are there to say what is legal and what is not legal. You're an agent of the law. You're not above the law. And the Israeli court is above the law. So what happens basically in Israel is that a leftist elite that can't win elections is controlling the court and has enlarged and augmented the power of the court so much that it became an uber government, that it can force Israel to do whatever. And now, by the way, many people are angry at the court because in a process which is complicated, the court or the judicial system has managed to curb the instructions for the soldiers of when they're allowed to open fire. And so in the Gaza perimeter, what was called a perimeter beyond the fence, the Gazans, Hamas, got nearer and nearer and nearer to the fence because the one standing order that anyone who comes, I don't remember the exact numbers, 500 meters from the fence is shot in the head dead. This is a death zone. You can't go here. And then human rights organizations appealed. And in the end, the court approved the army's instructions for opening fire. It approved them, but only after the army curbed them so much that it believed the court would approve them. So what happened is we saw a gradual erosion of deterrence near the Gaza fence. And then Palestinians got nearer and nearer. They called it demonstrations. But on the morning of October 7th, nobody raised an alarm that bulldozers were getting near the fence because they got us accustomed to bulldozers doing agricultural work near the fence. And so the strict and logical instructions that the army had were bent in order to get the court's approval. And so now many people are pointing at the court and saying, the court has been eroding our deterrence on this issue and many others. So there was an appeal by human rights organizations to say, stop this murderous policy of the IDF. They're shooting people dead instead of warning them or something else. And they appealed to the court. And if you just look at a bird's eye view of what happened, you'll say, oh, the court rejected the appeal and said the IDF can shoot. But that was only after the IDF changed its instruction to say that first you will shoot in the air, and then you will shoot at near, and then you will shoot at the foot, and only then will you shoot to kill. So the army that understands the system has been curbing its own instructions in order for the court to approve them. So when the court says, oh, we approved it, it doesn't even remotely begin to explain what happened, because this is what's happening everywhere. Everywhere, the court controls policy, not just because it strikes it down, because in advance, the ministers already get from their legal advisors what the court generally thinks. And so they try to fit their policy, curb it in such a way that the judges will approve of it. And so the legal reform was intended to give power back to elected officials, because technically speaking, I'm not a jurist, but I teach political science, so I can tell you that in our terms, sovereignty has basically been shifted from electoral politics to the judiciary.